Audrey Bennett had been sitting alone at a table set for two for over an hour. The candles weren't lit. The small cake hadn't been touched. She'd saved 3 months for this dinner, and the one person she'd invited hadn't come. At 8:15, she reached for her phone. That's when the door opened, and the whole restaurant went quiet. 3 men stepped in first and moved to the sides. The manager stopped what he was doing and lowered his head. The last man through the door didn't take off his coat. He was tall, somewhere near 40, unhurried, carrying a stillness that made the room drop its voice without anyone asking it to. In his hands was a wrapped gift. He crossed the floor and walked straight to Audrey's table, like he'd known exactly which one it was before he ever came inside. Miss Bennett. She stood up, phone still in her hand. I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong table. He set the gift down between the 2 unlit candles and pulled out the empty chair across from her. I don't think I do, he said. Audrey had never seen this man before in her life. She hadn't sent him an invitation. She hadn't told anyone in Boston it was her birthday. Anyone except one person. And that person wasn't here. And yet he sat down in the chair that wasn't his, folded his hands on the table, and waited for her to sit too. She didn't sit. Whoever you're looking for, she said. It isn't me. He glanced at the 2 candles, then back up at her, and something in his face didn't move at all. It's you, he said, so she asked him the only question she had left. Who sent you? For the first time all evening, the man didn't answer right away. If this story pulls you in, a like really helps it find more people. Share it with someone who'd want to hear it tonight, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's get back to the story. My mother, he said. Audrey blinked. The name meant nothing to her until he continued. Eleanor Marchetti. She stood frozen beside the chair she had just refused to sit in. Mrs. Eleanor, the 71-year-old woman she met every Tuesday. The only person in the world who knew that today was her birthday. She's your mother. It wasn't a question, only something Audrey needed to hear herself say before she could believe it. Yes. Where is she? The man didn't look away. At 6:50 this evening, my mother collapsed in the car on her way here. She's at Massachusetts General Hospital. Audrey heard every word clearly, but it took another heartbeat before she understood all of them. On her way here, she had set out. She hadn't forgotten. Is she alive? Yes. Audrey snatched up her purse. She didn't look back at the table, didn't look back at the meal she had saved for 3 months to pay for, and didn't say a word to the server. She simply walked straight toward the door. The man rose and followed her, moving slowly, as though he had known this was what she would do. Outside on the sidewalk, a car was already waiting with the door open. Miss Bennett. He didn't raise his voice. It's a 40-minute walk from here. Audrey looked at the car, then at him, then climbed inside. The car pulled away. She sat with her back straight, both hands clenched tightly around the strap of her purse, and in her mind rose the memory of an August evening 7 months earlier, when she had finished her shift at the bakery and was walking home along Hanover Street. An elderly woman had crumpled beside an iron railing, one hand gripping the horizontal bar, her head bowed low. People kept walking past. A couple veered toward the edge of the street to avoid her. A man holding a phone glanced over and continued on his way. Audrey had knelt on the sidewalk, called 911, taken off her coat and draped it over the woman's shoulders, then held that ice-cold hand for 20 minutes until the ambulance arrived. She asked where it hurt. She asked whether there was anyone she wanted her to call. She didn't ask who she was. 3 days later, the elderly woman came to Hollis Street Elementary School, carrying a box of pastries, stood at the reception desk, and said she wanted to see the 4th-grade teacher named Audrey. Audrey had invited her into the teacher's lounge and poured her a cup of coffee from the battered old vending machine in the corner Minnie K did. She drank the entire cup. Then she asked for another. The car turned. Audrey opened her eyes. The man beside her hadn't spoken a word during the entire drive. His hands rested on his knees, and his eyes remained fixed straight ahead. She was the one who broke the silence. She never mentioned your name. He didn't turn his head. I know. For 7 months, she told me about her son. She told me what you ate, how many hours you slept, how stubborn you were. Audrey heard the tremor in her own voice and tried to steady it. She never once told me your name. Preston, he said. Preston Marchetti. The surname made her falter for a heartbeat. She had heard it somewhere before, in a news story, in a scrap of gossip in the teacher's lounge. But she couldn't remember the context, and right now there wasn't enough room in her mind to think about it. "How did you know which table I was sitting at?" she asked. "My mother wrote down the name of the restaurant and the time you were meeting in her notebook. She wrote this too." Preston continued, his voice still even. "Don't let the girl sit alone." Audrey turned her face toward the window. She didn't want him to see her expression. 6:50, she whispered. "She was supposed to meet me at 7. "Yes, so she left early. My mother always leaves early." The car stopped in front of the emergency entrance. Audrey opened the door and stepped out before the driver could do anything, and she walked so quickly that Preston had to lengthen his stride to keep up. At the admissions desk, she gave Eleanor Marchetti's name. The employee behind the computer looked up at her, then glanced over her shoulder at the man who had just stepped up behind her, and the employee's face changed. It wasn't the kind of change that came over someone who had recognized a celebrity. It was something else. "Mr. Marchetti," the employee said, their voice dropping at once. "The waiting room is on the 3rd floor. Your people are already up there." Audrey turned to look at him. "Your people?" Preston offered no explanation. He merely gestured toward the elevators. "Come on, Miss Bennett," he said. "My mother is waiting for you." The doctor hadn't allowed anyone inside yet. Audrey sat down on a plastic chair in the 3rd floor hallway and waited, her hands resting on her lap, and she let her mind drift back to those Tuesday afternoons because they were the only place that still felt safe now. 7 months, nearly 30 meetings, always at the same inexpensive cafe 2 blocks from the school, always at the same table by the window. Mrs. Eleanor drank her coffee black and never added sugar. "My father taught 4th grade too," she told Audrey during their second meeting. "In Worcester. 31 years in one public school." Audrey asked what he had been like. "Poor," she answered at once, without needing to think. "Poor his entire life. He graded papers until 11 o'clock at night, then woke up at 5:30 the next morning. I asked him why he didn't find another kind of work, and he told me it was because there were children in his classroom who had no one else to depend on." She slowly turned the coffee cup between her hands. "I think about that more than I think about anything my husband ever said." On some afternoons, she talked about her son. She spoke of him the way people speak of something they have stopped trying to fix. "He cried easily as a child," she said. "Does that sound funny to you?" "He cried when the neighbor's dog died. He cried when he lost a ball game." Audrey asked what had happened after that. "Then, when he was 13, something happened in our home," she said, though she never told Audrey what it was. "After that day, he stopped crying. I've never seen him shed another tear. It's been 25 years. She looked out the window. "People think that means strength. I know it means a door closed." Audrey shared less about herself, but Mrs. Eleanor had a way of asking questions that made it impossible for her to hold things back. She told her that her mother had left when she was 4. She told her about 6 different foster families in Dorchester and Quincy, and how every time she moved, she had to learn the new name of yet another school. "Were any of the homes good?" the older woman asked. "2 of them were," Audrey answered. "One family was truly kind. They were simply too old to keep me for long." Mrs. Eleanor nodded slowly and said nothing more about it. Back in December, she had asked Audrey when her birthday was. Audrey told her it was March 14th. She asked what Audrey usually did that day. "Nothing," Audrey said. "I grade papers." The elderly woman set down her cup. "You're 27 years old?" "Yes. So no one has celebrated your birthday in 27 years. Audrey shrugged and smiled, the kind of smile she always used to close a subject. "It's not that important." "It is," Mrs. Eleanor said, and her voice was firmer than Audrey had ever heard it. "Listen to me. The day you were born was an important day, and it troubles me that for 27 years, no one has bothered to tell you that." Then she told Audrey to choose a restaurant. Audrey said she couldn't afford one. Mrs. Eleanor told her to choose anyway, so Audrey picked an ordinary place in Charlestown and began saving right then. On their final Tuesday together, as Audrey rose to leave, the elderly woman caught her by the wrist. "I'll be there," she said. "Don't light the candles before I arrive." A sound in the hallway pulled Audrey back to the present. She looked up and realized how long she had been sitting there without truly seeing what was around her. Now she looked. 4 men stood along the opposite wall, evenly spaced, none of them sitting, none of them speaking to one another. At the far end of the hallway, 2 more men stood near the turn that led to the stairwell. They weren't wearing hospital uniforms. They didn't look as though they were waiting for news about anyone either. A nurse came down the hallway pushing a medication cart, and Audrey watched her stop, take in the corridor, then turn the cart around and head back the way she had come. A few minutes later, 2 other employees passed by, and both lowered their eyes to the floor as they walked past Preston. No one greeted him. No one asked which patient he was related to. Yet no one told the 6 men to leave the hallway either, though every hospital had rules about such things. Preston stood about 5 paces from her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, his eyes fixed on the door to the hospital room. He hadn't asked the doctor a single question. He didn't pace back and forth. He simply stood there, and the entire hallway seemed to part around him of its own accord, like water flowing around a stone. Audrey watched him for a long time. Mrs. Eleanor had never told her what her son did for a living. For 7 months, she had said that he slept too little, barely ate, and was stubborn, but she had never once said where he worked. At the time, Audrey had assumed it was because she didn't want to boast. Sitting on that plastic chair now, in the middle of a corridor that an entire hospital was quietly avoiding, she began to suspect the reason was something else entirely. It was nearly 11 o'clock at night when the door opened and they were finally allowed inside. Audrey rose first, then stopped, uncertain whether she had the right to enter ahead of him. Preston gestured toward the door. "Go ahead. Inside the room, Mrs." Eleanor lay with her head turned toward the door, as though she had been waiting for the sound of footsteps. She looked smaller than Audrey remembered. Audrey walked around the foot of the bed, and the older woman reached out before she could say anything. Audrey took that hand between both of hers. Mrs. Eleanor squeezed back, weakly, but she did squeeze. Only then did she look over Audrey's shoulder toward the doorway, where her son stood. Preston had entered the room, but he went no farther. He stopped halfway between the door and the foot of the bed, his arms hanging at his sides. Then he raised one hand and gripped the iron rail at the end of the bed, only to let go again. "So you came," the older woman said to him. "I've been here since 8 o'clock. "I know. I was only asking." She turned back to Audrey. "I'm sorry, child. Please don't say that. I have to." Her voice was hoarse but clear. "I made you a promise. I've been waiting for tonight all month." Audrey shook her head and realized she was biting down hard on her lip. "How long did you sit there?" "Mrs." Eleanor asked. "Not long. You're a terrible liar." She let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. "I owe you a candle, Audrey. You owe me 2. Then 2 it is." Mrs. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "Did he bring the box?" Audrey looked up at Preston. He went outside and returned almost at once, then set the gift box on the edge of the bed instead of handing it directly to her. "Open it, child," the older woman said. "I can open it tomorrow." "No." Her voice hardened. "Now." Audrey untied the ribbon, removed the wrapping paper, and lifted the lid. Inside lay a silver pocket watch, with a long scratch running diagonally across the glass, and a chain worn smooth where fingers had held it most often. She picked it up, and it was heavier than she had expected. "It belonged to my father," Mrs. Eleanor said. Audrey asked no questions. Beneath it, tucked into the lining of the box, was a folded card. She opened it and recognized the older woman's handwriting, more slanted and unsteady than usual. There were only 2 lines. "The day you were born was a beautiful day. Don't let anyone in this world make you believe otherwise." Audrey read it twice. By the second time, she couldn't hold herself together any longer. She lowered her head against the edge of the bed and wept, one hand still holding Mrs. Eleanor's, the other clutching the card, and she cried the way someone cries after spending years teaching herself never to do it in front of another person. "Mrs." Eleanor didn't try to comfort her. She simply left her hand resting inside Audrey's and waited. At the foot of the bed, Preston remained exactly where he had been. He didn't come closer. He looked down at the floor, then toward the window, then placed his hand on the iron rail again and left it there, his fingers tightening until his knuckles turned white. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask his mother whether she was all right. He stood like a man who had been brought by mistake into a room where everyone spoke a language he had never learned. A long while later, after Audrey had lifted her head and wiped her face, "Mrs." Eleanor said, "Preston, come here." He walked over. She held out her other hand, and he took it awkwardly, as though he were holding something fragile. The older woman held both their hands, one on either side of her, and looked up at the ceiling instead of at either of them. "For 20 years, you've asked me what I wanted," she said. "On my birthday, At Christmas. Every time you felt guilty for being gone too long. You asked me what I wanted, and I told you I didn't need anything, so you kept buying me one thing after another. She squeezed his hand. This is what I want. Preston didn't answer. I want you to look at a person, the older woman said, without calculating how much they're worth. Just once will be enough. I'm asking you to do it once. The room remained silent for a very long time. Audrey sat motionless, understanding that those words weren't meant for her, yet somehow she was sitting in the middle of them. Preston looked down at his mother's hand inside his own. He made no promise. He didn't argue. He only gave one very small nod, and that was all he did. Mrs. Eleanor exhaled, then seemed to lose the last of her strength, her eyelids sinking closed. Next Tuesday, she murmured. The usual place. Yes, Audrey said. I'll repay you with 2 candles. Yes, ma'am. The older woman fell asleep. Audrey remained seated a little longer before gently slipping her hand free and standing. When she stepped into the hallway, she was still holding the watch and hadn't yet returned it to the box. Preston stood with his back to her, speaking very quietly to an older man she hadn't seen before. The man listened and nodded, and before Audrey could come any closer, he glanced at her, then immediately lowered his voice even further. The older man's name was Nico Bianchi, and Audrey learned that only because Preston called him by name as she walked past. She continued toward the row of plastic chairs, sat down, and had no intention of listening, but the late-night hallway was empty, and their voices still carried. Tell me, Preston said. Nico opened a small notebook. The driver called 911 at 6:52. He reported an address on Prince Street, said she was unconscious, and the dispatcher confirmed that an ambulance had been sent. He turned a page. The ambulance arrived at 7:31. Preston said nothing. 39 minutes, Nico said. Still nothing. Audrey looked down at the pocket watch in her palm and didn't understand why that number sent a chill down her spine, because she knew nothing about emergency response traffic in Boston, didn't know what was normal and what wasn't, but she heard something in the other man's silence. Do you want me to ask the hospital? Nico said. They may have been overwhelmed that night. Find out the reason. Preston said exactly those 4 words, without raising his voice or placing emphasis on any one of them. Nico closed the notebook. I'll have Julian handle it. Vehicles, routes, dispatch records, those things fall under his responsibility. Good. And the conversation ended there. Nico headed toward the elevator. Preston turned and caught Audrey watching, but he showed no reaction. He only said, The driver will take you home. You have a class to teach tomorrow morning. Audrey was about to refuse, then decided against it. She reached her apartment at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, placed the watch on the kitchen table, and sat staring at it until dawn was close. 4 days later, Mrs. Eleanor was visibly stronger. She could sit up, she could complain about the hospital food, and when Audrey pushed open the door on Friday afternoon, the older woman was reading the newspaper with the expression of someone who regarded hospitalization as a personal insult. Skipping class again, are you? She said without looking up. I came after I finished teaching. What time did you finish? 3:15. It's 4 o'clock now. Did you walk here? Audrey sat down. I took the bus. The older woman lowered the newspaper. Listen to me. I still won't be discharged by next Tuesday, but you're coming anyway. You're in the hospital. I didn't ask where I am. I asked whether you're coming. Audrey smiled. I'll come. Promise me. I promise. Good. The older woman folded the newspaper. Because I'm not going to let this ruin my Tuesday. I've endured your vending machine coffee for 7 months, and I'm not giving up halfway through. Preston arrived at nearly 5 o'clock. He was carrying a white cardboard box, which he set on the overbed table without saying what it was. Mrs. Eleanor glanced at the box, then at her son, then told Audrey to open it. Inside was a small cake and 2 candles. Where did you buy it? The older woman asked. Out there. Where out there? Eat it if you want it, Mother. Don't ask questions. Mrs. Eleanor burst out laughing, then coughed, then laughed again. Audrey placed the 2 candles on the cake. The older woman looked at her son. You light them. Preston drew a lighter from his coat pocket. His thumb settled on the wheel, and he stopped for a single beat, no longer than 1 breath. Then he struck the lighter and lit both candles. Mrs. Eleanor told Audrey to make a wish. Audrey closed her eyes. She didn't know what to wish for, so she wished that the older woman would be discharged soon, then blew out both candles. Mrs. Eleanor clapped twice and told her son to cut the cake, because she didn't trust anyone else in the room with a knife. Preston cut 3 slices, gave the first to his mother, the second to Audrey, then stood at the foot of the bed and ate the last one without sitting down. Mrs. Eleanor talked for the next 30 minutes, mostly to criticize the doctors. At one point, she turned to Audrey and asked how many children were in her class that year. Audrey said 26, and the older woman asked whether any of them were difficult. Audrey told her about a 9-year-old boy named Toby who stuttered and stayed behind for an extra 40 minutes every day to practice reading with her. Mrs. Eleanor listened very carefully. Is he making progress? Slowly, but he is. Slow progress is still progress. The older woman cast a very quick glance at her son as she said it, then immediately looked away. Audrey caught the look but didn't understand what it meant. At 6 o'clock, the nurse came in to take Mrs. Eleanor's blood pressure and said the patient needed to rest. Audrey rose and said goodbye. She had reached the door when Mrs. Eleanor called after her. Tuesday. Yes, ma'am. Tuesday. That was the last time Audrey ever heard her voice. The phone rang at 4:40 on Saturday morning, March 22nd. Audrey reached through the darkness and answered before she was fully awake. Is this Miss Bennett? It was an older man's voice, and she recognized it at once, though she had heard it only once before. This is Nico Bianchi. Yes. Mrs. Marchetti passed away at 4:10 this morning. Audrey sat up in bed. She heard herself repeat. 4:10. As though confirming the number might somehow change what it meant. Yes, her heart. Yesterday she was sitting up and reading the newspaper. I know, Nico said. I was there too. Audrey asked nothing more. She thanked him, then sat motionless on the edge of the bed for a long time, both feet resting on the cold floor. Then she stood, dressed, and left the apartment. It was still dark when she reached the hospital. On the 3rd floor, the hallway was filled with people in dark clothing, far more than there had been the night she sat there with the watch in her hand. They stood in clusters along both walls. No one was crying, no one spoke loudly, and every one of them looked up when the elevator doors opened. Audrey walked down the hallway toward the door to Mrs. Eleanor's room. A man stepped away from the wall and moved across her path. Where are you going? I'm going in to see Mrs. Eleanor. Who are you? I'm her friend. The man looked her over from head to toe, taking in the old coat, the walking shoes worn down at the heels, and the canvas bag slung across her body. This is a family matter, he said. Go home. Audrey didn't move. She didn't say anything more either, because she knew there was nothing she could say that this man would be willing to hear. They stood facing each other, and several of the people leaning against the walls behind them began turning to watch. Then the door to the hospital room opened, and Preston stepped into the hallway. He said nothing to the other man. He merely looked at him for about 2 seconds, his gaze as flat as if he were looking at a chair that had been placed where it didn't belong. The man stepped back once, then again, until his back was pressed against the wall. No one in the hallway said a word. Preston turned to Audrey. There was nothing on his face. No redness in his eyes, no weariness, nothing at all. You were the last person who made my mother laugh, he said. Go in. Audrey stayed inside for 10 minutes. When she came out, no one stopped her again, and the entire hallway watched in silence as she walked its full length to the elevator. The funeral was held on Thursday morning, March 27th, at a Catholic church in the North End. Audrey arrived 20 minutes early and intended to sit in the last pew, close to the exit. A young man in a suit stood in the center aisle and stopped her. He asked her name, listened to her answer, then said, "Please come with me," and led her straight to the front. He pointed to the first pew. Audrey said she could sit in the back. He merely shook his head and remained where he was until she sat down. Everyone in the first pew bore the name Marchetti, and she was the only one who didn't. She sat 4 seats away from Preston. Throughout the service, he didn't look at her even once. He didn't bow his head. He never raised a hand to his face. He sat with his back straight from beginning to end, like a man waiting for a formality to be completed. But someone else was watching her. Across the aisle in the second pew sat a man in his 50s, his hair neatly combed, both hands resting on his knees, his posture rigid throughout the service. He didn't join in the hymns. He didn't bow his head when everyone else bowed theirs. He watched Audrey. It wasn't a passing glance, and it wasn't by accident. Every time she looked up, his eyes were already fixed on her, and when she met his gaze, he didn't turn away. He only tilted his head slightly, as though confirming something to himself. At the end of the service, when everyone rose, Audrey quietly asked the woman beside her who he was. "Julian Crane," the woman said. "He's worked with this family for a very long time, since Mr. Marchetti was still alive." When Audrey reached the church steps, someone called her name. A man of about 65 carrying a leather briefcase introduced himself as Harold Finch, the attorney handling Mrs. Marchetti's estate. "Miss Bennett, there's something I need to discuss with you." "Yes. You need to attend the reading of the will, next Thursday at 9 o'clock in the morning, at our office on Federal Street." Audrey thought she had misheard him. "I believe you have the wrong person, sir." "I don't. Mr. Finch, I was only her friend. I knew her for 7 months. I'm not family." The older man looked at her for a moment, then opened his briefcase, took out a business card, and handed it to her. "Mrs. Marchetti didn't think so," he said. Then he fastened the briefcase again, inclined his head in farewell, and walked down the steps. Audrey stood there holding the business card, reading the name printed on it again and again, without truly seeing any of the letters. 7 months, nearly 30 cups of vending machine coffee, 1 small cake in a hospital room, and 2 candles the older woman had never had the chance to repay in full. Audrey looked up and saw Julian Crane standing at the bottom of the steps, about 15 paces away, his hands clasped behind his back, though she had no idea how long he had been there. He didn't approach her. He said nothing. He merely looked down at the business card in her hand, then lifted his eyes to her face, before turning and walking toward the line of waiting cars. On Thursday morning, April 3rd, Audrey arrived at the office on Federal Street 20 minutes before her appointment and waited in the lobby because she didn't dare go upstairs early. It was 5 minutes to 9 before she finally entered the conference room, and everyone in the room turned to look at her. The conference table was long, with 17 members of the Marchetti family filling the seats on both sides. No one greeted her. The only empty chair was at the far end of the table, the most distant seat in the room, and Audrey sat down there with her bag resting in her lap. Preston sat on the opposite side, the entire length of the table between them. He didn't look at her. Julian Crane sat midway down the row on the right, one hand resting on a stack of papers of his own. Harold Finch opened his briefcase and began reading at exactly 9 o'clock. The first section was long and dry. The Beacon Hill house was left to Preston. A sum of money went to the church. 3 separate bequests went to 3 grandchildren. Money was left to the housekeeper who had worked for Mrs. Marchetti for 22 years. Each time a name was read aloud, someone in the room gave a quiet nod. Then Finch turned the page. Article 11, regarding Miss Audrey Bennett. The entire table fell silent. "I leave to Audrey Bennett, my father's writing desk, currently located in the East Room on the 2nd floor of the Beacon Hill house. I also leave her the sum of $40,000 to pay in full the college tuition debt the child never told me about, though I knew she had it." Audrey sat frozen. $40,000 was the exact amount she owed, not $1 more or less. She had never told anyone that number. Around the table, the tension eased. Someone leaned back in his chair. A man seated near the head of the table exhaled sharply and glanced at the person beside him, and both of them gave a faint shrug. That was all. An old desk and $40,000. They had feared far more than that. Audrey opened her mouth to say she wouldn't accept it, but Finch had already turned to the next page. Article 12, regarding the Ashmont Trust. The woman seated beside Julian jerked her head up. The Ashmont Trust is a charitable trust established by Mrs. Eleanor Marchetti in 1996, with assets currently valued at $240 million. Chairs shifted around the table. Finch didn't look up. The trust's assets include 11 buildings in Boston and the surrounding area, acquired by Mrs. Marchetti between 1979 and 1994, using the inheritance she received from her father and profits reinvested from those same properties. The older man paused, then read the next sentence, which Audrey immediately understood had been written by Mrs. Eleanor herself. "I am stating this clearly so that no one will have cause to argue about it later. My husband never contributed a single cent to this trust. Not because he didn't want to, because I wouldn't let him." No one laughed. The Ashmont Trust is legally and financially separate from every other operation, asset, and individual within the Marchetti family. The trust isn't part of the estate to be divided among the heirs. The trust isn't owned by Mr. Preston Marchetti. The man in his 80s, seated at the head of the table, turned to look at Preston. Preston didn't move. He remained in exactly the same position he had held at the beginning, both hands resting on the table, his eyes fixed on Finch. He didn't ask a single question. Article 13, Finch said, regarding the Board of Trustees. Audrey could hear her heart pounding in her ears. The Ashmont Trust will be governed by a board of 3 trustees. First, Mr. Harold Finch. Second, Mr. Preston Marchetti. Third, Miss Audrey Bennett. A chair toppled over. Julian Crane sprang to his feet. What did you just read? Finch looked up over his glasses. I read Article 13. Who is she? Miss Bennett is the person Mrs. Marchetti appointed. She knew this woman for a matter of months. 7, Finch said. Mrs. Marchetti stated that clearly in the records. Julian remained standing. I've worked with this family for 30 years. Are you telling me she placed $240 million in the hands of an elementary school teacher no one in this room has ever met? I'm telling you that every expenditure from the trust requires at least 2 affirmative votes out of 3. Finch replied, his voice still even. None of these 3 people can decide the fate of a single dollar alone. That is what Mrs. Marchetti wanted. She was ill. She wasn't ill when she signed it. The entire room went still. Finch turned the file around and pointed to one page. This amendment was signed on February 28th, 3 weeks before her death. I was present, along with 2 independent witnesses, and her personal physician signed a statement confirming her mental competence on that same day. Anyone who wishes to challenge it is free to do so, but I advise against it. Julian sat down very slowly. He never took his eyes off Audrey. Audrey placed both hands flat on the table to keep them from trembling. Mr. Finch. Everyone in the room turned toward her. I refuse. Finch looked at her. I won't accept it, she said. Not the desk, not the money, not the trust. I didn't know her long enough to accept anything in this room. I only want to go back to teaching. Someone near the middle of the table murmured something Audrey couldn't make out. Finch removed his glasses, cleaned them, then put them back on. Miss Bennett, I understand, but you can't refuse. Why not? Because Mrs. Marchetti anticipated that you would say those exact words. He turned another page. She included a 90-day provision. For 90 days beginning today, you don't have the right to decline this position. Once those 90 days have passed, if you still wish to step down, I'll prepare the paperwork for you that very afternoon. Audrey looked down at the surface of the table. 90 days. She included one more sentence, Finch said. I'll read it exactly as she wrote it. Don't let the child run away before she has time to understand why I chose her. At the opposite end of the table, for the first time that entire morning, Preston turned his head and looked at her. Audrey didn't wait for the elevator. She took the stairs down 4 floors and stepped into the underground parking garage beneath the building. She had gone about 20 paces when she heard the metal door open behind her. Miss Bennett, she turned. Preston stood at the foot of the stairs, alone, 7 or 8 paces away, and he came no closer. You knew about this, she said. No. You sat in there all morning without asking a single question. People were shouting over $240 million, and you sat there in silence as if you already knew everything. I knew my mother had the trust. I didn't know she had changed her will. Audrey tightened her grip on the strap of her bag. Then what is this? What is your family planning to do with me? I don't understand what you mean. What I understand is that I've just been shoved into the middle of something I never asked for, in front of 17 people who looked at me as if I were a thief. Her voice echoed through the empty garage. I think this is some kind of game. Rich people always seem to have games like this. Put a stranger's name in for amusement, let the family fight among themselves, then 3 months later buy my signature with a check. Preston listened to every word. He didn't interrupt her. If it were a game, he said, you wouldn't have been given $40,000, the exact amount of your debt. Audrey fell silent. My mother didn't play games with money, he continued, and she didn't play games with people. She looked at him for a long time. The garage was so quiet that she could hear the ventilation fans turning. Then I'm going to ask you one question, she said, and I want an honest answer. All right. Who are you? Preston's posture didn't change. He didn't come closer, and he didn't look away. You've already guessed, he said. I want to hear you say it. I'm the head of a family, he said. Not a company, not an investment fund. An organization. It has been in Boston since before I was born, and I took control of it when I was 31, after my father died. What kind of organization? You already know what kind. I want you to say it. And he did. He spoke plainly, without evasion or metaphor. He told her that his family controlled freight operations in several of the northern ports, that they lent money, that certain businesses paid them to be left in peace, and that there were people in this city who called him before they called the police. He didn't use a single word to soften any of it. He didn't say it belonged to the past. He didn't claim that he handled only the legitimate side. When he had finished, he stood in silence and waited. Audrey felt her hands turn cold, but she didn't step back. "You're not apologizing," she said. "No, and you're not explaining yourself. What would an explanation change? You asked who I am," I answered. She nodded slowly, realizing that what sent a shiver through her wasn't what he had just told her, but the way he had told it, evenly, without raising his voice once, as if he were reading from an inventory. "She knew, didn't she?" Audrey asked. "My mother knew everything. She knew who you were," Audrey said, "and she still sat drinking vending machine coffee with me every Tuesday in that teacher's lounge with the window that wouldn't close properly. For 7 straight months. She drank 2 full cups, complained that it was terrible, then came back the next week." Preston said nothing. "She told me about your father," Audrey continued, "about how he graded papers until 11 o'clock at night. She told me how many hours he slept, what he ate, and how stubborn he was. She talked to me about you for 7 months, but she never once told me your name, and I thought it was because she didn't want to boast." Audrey gave a short laugh with no amusement in it. "It turns out it was the other way around." "You're wrong," Preston said. Audrey looked up. "She didn't hide my name from you to protect me," he said. "She hid it to protect you." The garage fell silent again. "I have a question for you as well," he said. "All right. During those 7 months, did my mother ever mention you to me?" Audrey didn't understand. "I don't know. How could I know that?" "No," Preston said. "Not one word." He remained exactly where he was, his hands still in the pockets of his coat. "She called me twice every week. She told me what she was reading, whom she had argued with, and what she was unhappy about. For 7 months, she met with you nearly 30 times, and she never once told me there was a woman named Audrey Bennett." Audrey stared at him. "The first time I learned your name was on the afternoon of your birthday," he said. "When they brought me her notebook from the car, she couldn't answer." "My mother told me everything," Preston said. "For 38 years. You were the only secret she ever kept from me." His voice didn't rise when he said it, but Audrey heard something beneath the words, something she couldn't name. She lowered her eyes to the concrete floor. "I don't want that trust," she said quietly. "I know. In 90 days, I'll sign the papers and step down. That is your right. You're not going to try to persuade me?" "No," Preston said. He turned and walked toward the car, waiting at the far end of the garage. After a few steps, he stopped. "Miss Bennett?" "Yes?" "That writing desk," he said. "It's in the east room on the 2nd floor. Whenever you want to collect it, call Finch. Don't call me." Then he walked away, leaving Audrey alone in the parking garage, her hand still gripping the strap of her bag. It wasn't until the car had disappeared completely that she realized he hadn't taken a single step closer to her during their entire conversation. On Monday morning, Audrey went to work as she did every day, and tried to live as though the previous Thursday morning had never happened. She had 26 children in her class, and a spelling test to grade, and that was far easier than thinking about 90 days. At lunchtime, Principal Marisol Reyes knocked on her classroom door. "Do you have 10 minutes?" In her office, she pushed a stack of papers across the desk. "The district has made its final decision. Hollis Street will close at the end of this school year." Audrey picked up the papers but didn't read them. 340 children, Marisol said. "They'll be divided among 3 schools, one in Roslindale, one in Hyde Park, and one all the way out in Mattapan. The child who lives farthest away will spend nearly an hour on the bus every afternoon. Starting when?" "September." Audrey set the papers down. "Have you applied for funding?" Marisol opened a drawer and took out a thick plastic folder. 11 places, she said. 4 private foundations, 3 educational organizations, 2 banks, 1 insurance corporation, and 1 federal program. She turned through the pages one by one. Rejected, rejected, rejected. This one didn't even respond. I had to call 3 times before someone finally told me the application had been eliminated in the first round. Audrey looked at the papers. 11 names, 11 dead ends. Why? Because we're small. Because our test scores aren't impressive enough for them to display on their homepages. Because 70% of our students receive free lunch. Marisol closed the folder. People like funding places that are about to succeed. No one likes funding a place that is about to sink. That afternoon, after the dismissal bell rang and the classroom had emptied, Toby Whitaker remained in his seat at the front of the room as he did every day. He was 9 years old, with sandy hair, and he had been staying behind like this since October of the previous year. Audrey pulled over a chair and sat beside him. What page are we on today? PP page F. 41. All right, read slowly. I'm not timing you. Toby opened the book. The first sentence took nearly a minute. At the third word, he stopped. His throat caught around a sound that wouldn't come out. His face reddened, and his fingers began tapping against the edge of the desk. Audrey didn't prompt him. She didn't read the word for him. She simply placed one finger beneath it and waited. Toby exhaled, tried again, and this time, the word came free. There, she said. Keep going. They did this for 40 minutes every day, 5 days a week, and had done so since October. Back then, Toby needed 4 minutes to read a single sentence. Now he needed 1. Some days, only 40 seconds. No one at the school district knew that number because there was no column for it on any statistical report. At 4 o'clock, his mother arrived to pick him up. Denise Whitaker worked shifts at a grocery store and was always 15 minutes late, and she always apologized. Miss Bennett, I've made you wait again. You're not making me wait. I stay because I want to. Denise stood in the classroom doorway, watching her son put his books into his bag. Last year, he refused to read in front of the class, she said softly. He said he'd rather take a 0. Last week he volunteered. Audrey didn't know what to say. Don't laugh when I tell you this, Denise said. He reads to me every night before bed. He says he's practicing so Miss Bennett will be happy. After mother and son had gone, Audrey remained seated in the empty classroom. 340 children. September. She thought of Toby boarding a bus at 6:45 in the morning to travel to a school where no one would know how long it took him to finish a sentence, and where no one would stay behind for 40 minutes because no one was paid to do it. She took out her phone, then put it away again. The following evening, Marisol called her at nearly 9 o'clock. Are you still awake? Yes. I just came from a meeting with the city's public property department. Her voice sounded entirely different from the way it had the previous afternoon. Audrey, I thought the worst problem was that we didn't have enough money. It isn't. What do you mean? The building, Marisol said. Our school building. The city owns it, and the city has placed it on the property disposal list. They already have a buyer, a real estate development company. They plan to turn it into apartments. Audrey sat upright. When? The sale closes in 90 days. Audrey said nothing. Are you listening to me, Audrey? These are 2 separate problems. The first is operating money, teachers' salaries, tutoring programs, buses, lunches. If we found a sponsor, that part could be saved, but it wouldn't buy the building. So even if we had the money, Marisol said, we still wouldn't have anywhere to teach in September. They're selling the building. Audrey stood and walked to the window. 90 days. It was the second time she had heard that number in less than a week, and this time it hadn't come from an attorney in a conference room while 17 people stared at her. Have you tried talking to the city? She asked. I have. They said the school is closing anyway, so what would be the point of keeping an empty building? Marisol exhaled. They aren't wrong. That's the worst part. The call ended. Audrey stood at the window for a very long time. Then she went into the kitchen, opened a drawer, and took out the business card Harold Finch had given her on the church steps. She sat down at the table, placed the card in front of her, and stared at it until dawn. It took Audrey 4 nights to prepare the proposal. She did it exactly the way she prepared every proposal she submitted to the district, with tables, figures, and source citations, without a single line of pleading. On Saturday morning, she printed 2 copies, placed them in her bag, and took the subway to the North End. Finch had given her the address after listening to what she wanted, remaining silent for a moment, then telling her to go there without calling first. A man stood at the entrance. He looked at her, asked her name, then nodded and opened the door. There were 2 more men in the hallway, and both merely stepped aside to let her pass. On the second floor, a third man stood outside the office door, and he asked no questions either. He simply knocked twice, then opened the door and let her in. No one stopped her. No one searched her bag. Audrey understood that someone had given orders in advance, and she understood that it meant Preston had known she was coming, perhaps even before she herself had decided to come. Preston sat behind his desk. He gestured toward the chair across from him. Audrey sat down, opened her bag, and placed one copy of the proposal in front of him. "I'm asking for 15 minutes, she said. "Go ahead." She turned to the first page. Hollis Street Elementary School in Charlestown. 340 students and 19 teachers. The city school district will close the school at the end of this academic year because enrollment falls below the required level, and the operating budget has been cut for 4 consecutive years. She turned the page. This is the actual cost of keeping the school open for another 5 years. Teachers' salaries, insurance, utilities, lunches, buses, and the after-school supplemental reading program. I calculated it using this year's actual salaries, with an additional 4% each year for inflation and step increases. Preston pulled the proposal closer. "The total is $2,400,000, she said. "Divided evenly, that comes to $480,000 a year. Every expense is itemized on pages 4 through 9. He turned to page 7. "Where did you get these figures?" "From the district's public financial reports. Anyone can download them." "How much does the supplemental reading program cost?" "More than $60,000 a year. It's the first thing the city cuts whenever money runs short, and it's the only thing I refuse to cut." Preston continued turning the pages. He read for longer than Audrey had expected. "What is page 11? "The part I need to explain before you ask." She straightened in her chair. "I'm one of the 3 trustees of the Ashmont Trust. I'm also a tenured teacher at the school applying for money from that same trust. That is a conflict of interest. Under Massachusetts law, it isn't a minor matter, and even if there were no law, it would still be wrong." Preston looked up. "So I'm recusing myself from this vote," she said. "I'll sign a written statement for Mr. Finch making it clear that I won't participate in the discussion, won't take part in the vote, and won't receive any personal benefit from this expenditure. I've also told Principal Reyes that if the funding is approved, I won't accept any salary increase that comes from it." He set the proposal down. "Do you understand what that means?" "Yes." "What does it mean?" "It means I lose my vote," Audrey said. "The trust requires 2 votes out of 3 for approval. If I remove mine, only you and Mr. Finch remain. That means I need both of you. It means that if you vote no, this proposal dies, and there's no way to save it." Preston looked at her. "You could keep your vote," he said. "No one is making you do this. Someone is." "Who?" "I am," she said. The room was silent for a moment. "I've spent 5 years teaching at that school," Audrey continued. "If we manage to save it tomorrow with my own vote, then for the rest of my life there will always be someone who says Miss Bennett took money for her own school. And they would be right. I don't want to save that school in a way I'll have to hide later." Preston tapped one finger against the desk once, then stopped. "Why should I care?" he asked. Audrey didn't blink. "You don't have to care," she said. "You only have to vote." He looked at her. One corner of his mouth moved slightly, no more than the width of a single thread, then returned to where it had been. "This proposal," he said. "How long did it take you?" 4 nights. "You were still teaching during the day?" "Yes." "And working shifts at the bakery?" Audrey faltered. She had never told him about that. "My mother wrote it in her notebook," Preston said, answering the question she hadn't yet had time to ask. He closed the proposal and pushed it to one side, and for 2 seconds Audrey thought she had failed. "I haven't decided," he said. "All right. I don't make decisions based on paper." He stood, walked to the window, and remained there with his back to her. "Can you imagine how many beautiful proposals people bring me every year? Everyone has tables. Everyone has a 5-year plan." He turned around. "I'll come see the school." Audrey remained still. "When?" "Next week. I won't tell you the day in advance. Do you want me to prepare anything?" "No," Preston said. "Teach the way you do every other day. If you arrange anything for me to see, I'll know, and then I'll vote against it." Audrey stood, placed the second copy of the proposal on his desk, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped. "Mr. Marchetti." "What?" "You were right when you said I could keep my vote," she said. "But you could also have sat there and refused to hear a single word I said this morning." "You didn't have to give me 15 minutes. Preston didn't answer. She walked down the stairs, passing the 3 men who still stood exactly where they had been before, and not one of them looked at her even once. He came on Wednesday morning, and Audrey had no warning at all. She was writing an assignment on the board when she saw Marisol leading a man through the classroom door, and she had to look twice before she recognized him. Preston wore a rough textured jacket and jeans, with no tie, and no one accompanied him. He carried no briefcase. He entered the classroom, gave Audrey one brief nod in greeting, then walked straight to the last row of desks and lowered himself onto a student chair far too small for him. Several children turned to look. "This is a visitor to our school," Audrey said. "Turn around." And that was the end of it. The children really did turn back, because to them, an unfamiliar adult sitting at the rear of the classroom was nowhere near as interesting as the math problem on the board. He sat there for 40 minutes. Audrey taught the rest of the math lesson, then moved on to reading, and she did exactly as he had instructed. She didn't change her lesson plan, didn't call on the strongest students, and didn't perform for him. One child had forgotten his notebook. 2 children whispered to each other, and she had to stop and remind them to pay attention. Another asked a question that had nothing to do with the lesson, making the whole class laugh, and it took nearly 3 minutes to settle them down again. Preston wrote nothing. He merely sat there with his back straight and both hands resting on the tiny desk before him. At noon, the class went down to the cafeteria. Audrey brought her lunchbox as she did every day and sat at the end of one of the long tables with the children. One boy sat with his hands on the table and nothing in front of him. Audrey noticed, but she didn't ask why, didn't say anything aloud, and didn't call anyone over. She simply opened her lunchbox, divided her sandwich in half, placed one half and the apple on the boy's tray, then continued eating what remained while talking to the child on her other side about the game the night before. No one at the table paid any attention. Clearly, it happened so often that it no longer seemed remarkable. Preston stood at the far end of the cafeteria with Marisol. "How long has Miss Bennett taught here?" he asked. 5 years, Marisol said. "She came here straight out of college. Has she ever asked to transfer?" "No, but she has received offers." Marisol looked down the row of tables. Twice. Once from a private school in Brookline, and once from a school in Wellesley. Both offered twice what she earns here, classes of 15 students, and a dedicated teaching assistant. She turned them down? Both times. The second school even called me to ask whether I was pressuring her to stay. Marisol folded her arms. I told them I had nothing with which to pressure her. I pay her $30,000 less a year than they would. That afternoon, after the dismissal bell rang, Preston still hadn't left. He stood in the hallway behind the glass classroom door, while Toby Whitaker remained at his desk inside, as he did every day. Audrey pulled over a chair and sat beside him. "What page would you like to read today?" "Miss Bennett." Toby held the book in both hands. I want to read a whole page." "The whole page?" "Yes." "All right. I'll sit right here." He began. The first sentence took more than 30 seconds, and he became stuck once. The second went more smoothly. By the 4th sentence, Audrey realized that not all the children had gone home. 4 or 5 of them were standing in the classroom doorway, and not one of them made a sound. Toby kept reading. He stumbled on the 9th line, stopped, breathed, then tried again, and made it through. By the time he reached the final line, the doorway was crowded with children, and when Toby finished the last word and closed the book, they applauded. His face turned bright red, and he lowered his eyes to the desk. Audrey stood, walked around to the other side, then crouched in front of him until her eyes were level with his. "Toby." He looked up. "Do you see?" she said. "No one is born broken." Toby smiled, the open smile of a child who hadn't yet learned to hide. The children in the doorway rushed inside, and one of them gave him a light punch on the shoulder. For the next 2 minutes, the classroom was as loud as a marketplace. In the hallway, Preston turned and walked away. He didn't say goodbye to Audrey. He said nothing to Marisol. He walked the length of the hallway, descended the stairs, and passed through the school gates, and no one in the schoolyard knew who the man walking past them was. That evening, at 8:15, Harold Finch called Audrey. "Miss Bennett, I'm notifying you in accordance with official procedure. The trustees have just voted on the funding proposal for Hollis Street Elementary School. Audrey rose from her chair. You recused yourself from the vote. I received your written statement on Monday and placed it in the official record. That left 2 votes. Yes, I voted in favor, Finch said. I stated my reason for the minutes. This is the finest proposal I've read in the 3 years I've held this position. The figures have sources, the costs are substantiated, and not a single expense has been invented. Audrey couldn't speak. Mr. Marchetti also voted in favor, Finch continued. He gave no reason. She sat on the edge of the bed. Then that means 2 out of 2, the old man said. The $2,400,000 has been approved. I'll send the official notification to Principal Reyes tomorrow morning. He paused. Miss Bennett, I'd like to add one thing that falls outside official procedure. Yes. You gave up your own vote. That means the final decision rested entirely on his. Finch spoke slowly. You understand, don't you? From this point forward, if anyone asks why your school received that money, there will be only one name in the official record answering that question. Audrey looked out the window. I understand, she said. Good, Finch replied. Congratulations. Then he ended the call. The next 3 weeks were the best Audrey had known in years. Marisol called back all 19 teachers and signed their contracts for the new school year ahead of schedule. The supplemental reading program received its own funding and expanded from 1 class to 4. A Charlestown neighborhood newspaper published a 300-word article on an inside page with a headline stating that a private trust had saved Hollis Street School, naming no one except the principal. No one paid it any attention. The first meeting of the trustees took place on a Thursday afternoon at Finch's office. Audrey arrived on time, carrying the documents she had carefully read twice. There were 4 items on the agenda. The first 3 passed quickly. The fourth was Preston's proposal for $1,200,000 to renovate the facades and heating systems of 2 buildings owned by the trust in the South End. I object, Audrey said. Finch looked up. Preston didn't. State your reason, Finch said. She opened the documents to the page she had marked. These 2 buildings are rental properties with an occupancy rate of 91%, and there haven't been any complaints about the heating systems in the past 2 years. The cost estimate allocates $700,000 of the total to the facades. A facade doesn't make anyone warmer. She pushed the page across the table. If we separate the heating work into its own project, the cost is $400,000. I'll approve that amount today. As for the other $700,000, I want to know why it costs twice as much as the work that's actually necessary. No one spoke for several seconds. I vote against it, Audrey said. Finch looked at Preston, then lowered his eyes to the documents. I vote against it as well, the old man said. Miss Bennett is right. This figure is off. Preston closed his folder. Then it's rejected, he said, his voice no different from when he had greeted them at the beginning of the meeting. Mr. Finch, have the estimate redone and separate the heating work. I'll present it again next month. Then the meeting moved on to the final item. Audrey sat there and realized that the mechanism Eleanor had written into her will wasn't merely a line of legal language. It had just operated before her eyes, and it had worked exactly as the old woman intended. It was already dark when the meeting ended. Audrey was walking toward the subway station when a car pulled up to the curb and Preston lowered the window. He was driving himself, and there was no one else in the car. Are you going back to Charlestown? Yes. Get in. She hesitated for a second, then opened the door. They had been driving for several minutes when she asked, Aren't you angry? About what? About the fact that I just rejected your $1,200,000 proposal. You rejected $700,000, he said. I'll get the other $400,000 next month. Audrey laughed before she could stop herself. The car turned, and she realized he hadn't asked where she lived. He drove straight to her block and stopped in front of the correct address. You know where I live. You gave Finch your address when you signed the recusal papers. Audrey didn't entirely believe him, but she didn't ask anything else. 3 days later, she worked the evening shift at the bakery, as she did every Saturday, from 9 o'clock until 1 in the morning. At around 11:30, while she was wiping down the counter, she looked outside and saw a car parked across the street. She recognized it. She finished cleaning the counter, stacked the trays, balanced the register, and every time she looked up, the car was still there. It remained parked for exactly 20 minutes. No one got out. No one honked. Then it drove away. The next morning, Audrey sent him a text consisting of a single line, asking whether he had business in the neighborhood the night before. He replied 4 hours later, also with a single line. No. At the end of the month, after another meeting, he drove her home again. The car stopped in front of her building, but she didn't get out immediately. May I ask you something? Yes. That day in the conference room for the reading of the will, she said, Mr. Crane stood up and shouted at Mr. Finch in front of 17 people. You sat there without saying a word. That day in the parking garage, I said some very harsh things to you, and you remained silent then too. Today, I rejected your proposal in front of your own attorney. She turned toward him. Why do you never get angry? Preston stared straight ahead through the windshield. He was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Because the last time I got angry, he said, someone never came home. Audrey didn't ask anything more. She opened the car door, thanked him, and went inside. That same week, in the North End, Julian Crane placed a thin file on Preston's desk. The matter from the night of March 14th, he said. I've finished looking into it. Preston opened the file. There were 3 pages inside. I spoke with Dispatch, the ambulance transport company, and the transportation department, Julian said. There was road work at 2 points along the route that night, along with a collision on Cambridge Street that backed up the entire area. The ambulance had to take a detour. He clasped his hands behind his back. Traffic, nothing more. Preston turned through all 3 pages, then closed the file. All right, he said. I'm sorry there's no one for you to blame, Julian said. Sometimes it's simply bad luck, sir. He walked out. Preston remained seated with the file in front of him and didn't open it again. The following Monday morning, Audrey was handing back the spelling tests when the classroom door opened. Marisol stood in the doorway, holding an iPad in one hand and gripping the doorframe with the other. Her face was deathly pale. Audrey, she said, come out here with me for a moment. In the hallway, Marisol handed her the iPad. The article was on the front page of the Boston Globe's digital edition, published at 5:10 that morning. $2,400,000 in Mafia money flow into a public elementary school, and the crime boss who cast the deciding vote. Beneath the headline were 2 photographs. The first showed Preston opening a car door for Audrey outside a law office on Federal Street, taken from across the street, the image perfectly clear. The second had been taken inside the church on the day of the funeral, with Audrey sitting in the front pew among people who bore the Marchetti name. Audrey read the entire article. It was nearly 2,000 words long and didn't accuse her of a single thing. It merely laid out the events in order. Preston Marchetti was the head of the oldest criminal organization in the North End. His mother had died in March. 3 weeks before her death, she had amended her will to place a 27-year-old elementary school teacher on the board of a trust worth $240 million. That teacher had then submitted a funding proposal for the very school where she taught. She had recused herself from the vote, which meant the money had been approved by the votes of 2 men, with Mr. Marchetti casting the deciding vote. Every sentence was true. Not one of them was false. In the final paragraph, the reporter wrote that the newspaper had contacted all 3 trustees, and none had responded. The comment section already contained more than 900 posts. Audrey read only the first 2 before locking the screen. So now we know why that tiny little school got the money. This girl is something else. In 7 months, she managed to reel in both an old woman and her son. The next 48 hours passed very quickly. On Monday afternoon, the city school district sent Audrey a letter informing her that she would be placed on paid administrative leave beginning Tuesday morning, while the matter was reviewed. On Tuesday morning, the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education opened proceedings to review her teaching license. On Tuesday afternoon, the State Ethics Commission announced that it had opened a case under Chapter 268A concerning a public employee's conflict of interest. On Tuesday evening, the school office received requests from 7 parents to transfer their children to other classes. On Wednesday morning, a federal agent named Teresa Kane called Harold Finch and informed him that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had opened a preliminary money laundering investigation into the Ashmont Trust. That same Wednesday morning, Denise Whitaker came to the school office and signed the papers to transfer Toby to another class. Marisol called Audrey to tell her, before she heard it from someone else. Did she say anything? Audrey asked. Marisol was silent for a moment. She cried, she said. She said she was sorry, but Toby has no one except her, and she couldn't risk having her son's name connected to this. Audrey said she understood, then ended the call. On Wednesday afternoon, she went to the school for the last time to clear out her belongings. She had been instructed to do it after 4 o'clock, when all the students had gone home. She brought 2 cardboard boxes. She took the alphabet chart down from the wall, packed the 45 books in the reading cabinet that she had purchased with her own salary over the course of 5 years, and removed the sign bearing the names of 26 children from the classroom door. She worked very slowly and very neatly, as though careful hands might somehow make it hurt less. Near 5 o'clock, she looked up and saw someone in the hallway. Toby Whitaker stood on the other side of the glass, his school bag hanging from his shoulders, one hand resting on the window ledge. He didn't come inside. The classroom door was closed, and he didn't open it. His mother stood about 10 steps away at the end of the hallway and didn't come any closer. Toby reached into his bag, took out his reading book, and held it at eye level so Audrey could see. He opened it to a page, pointed at the page, then nodded twice. Audrey set down the stack of books in her hands. She raised her thumb. Toby smiled, closed the book, and put it back in his bag. He waved once, then turned away. His mother held out her hand, and the two of them walked down the hallway together. Denise didn't look back even once. Audrey watched until the door at the far end of the hallway closed behind them. Then she turned back toward the classroom. She stood there for a while between the 2 nearly full cardboard boxes, among 26 empty desks, surrounded by walls stripped bare, except for the marks left by pieces of tape. Then her legs gave way, and she sank to the floor with her back against the base of the blackboard, and she cried. She cried without making a sound, both hands covering her face, her shoulders trembling, and she went on crying for a very long time in that empty room. The phone in her pocket vibrated several times. She didn't take it out. At 6 o'clock, the security guard walked past, looked inside, then quietly continued on, and turned off the hallway lights at the far end. Audrey remained on the floor until darkness had settled completely. Then she stood, wiped her face with her sleeve, carried the 2 boxes to the door, switched off the classroom light, and closed the door behind her. She arrived in the north end at 9 o'clock that night, the 2 cardboard boxes still in the trunk of the taxi. The man at the entrance had only begun to speak when she walked straight past him. The 2 men in the hallway stepped forward half a pace, then stopped when they saw that she had no intention of stopping. She went up to the 2nd floor, and before the man stationed outside the office could knock, she pushed the door open herself and walked in. Preston was standing beside his desk with the phone pressed to his ear. He looked at her, spoke 2 words into the phone, then ended the call. "I called you 4 times, he said. "I know. Sit down. I'll stand." He set the phone down. "I'll take care of this." "No, Miss Bennett." I said no. He fell silent. "How are you planning to take care of it?" she asked. "Call the newspaper? Call someone at the department? Tell the ethics commission to close the case? You can do it. I know you can. And that's exactly the problem. The problem is that you've lost your job." "No." Audrey placed one hand on the back of the chair. "The problem is that if you make one phone call and everything disappears tomorrow, this entire city will know that whenever you want something to disappear, it disappears. And then everything that article said will become true, including the parts it didn't dare put into words." Preston didn't answer. "Every time you protect me," she said, "people will assume you have something to hide." "I don't care what people assume. I do." She didn't say it loudly, but he looked up. "I gave 5 years to that school," Audrey said. 5 years making 340 children believe that there was at least one adult in their lives who wouldn't abandon them halfway through. Some of them live with their grandparents. Some have mothers who work 2 shifts. Some have already changed schools 3 times in 4 years. She paused. "I won't trade that for peace you bought for me. You'll lose your license. Maybe. Do you understand that if you lose your license in this state, you won't be able to teach in any other state?" "I understand. Then what do you want?" Audrey looked directly at him. "I don't want you to save me," she said. "I want transparency." The room remained silent for a very long time. Preston moved behind the desk, but he didn't sit. He merely stood there with both hands braced against its surface. "Do you think they'll investigate this fairly?" he asked. "I don't know." "I do. They won't investigate the trust. They'll investigate me, attach my name to you, close the file, and call that a conclusion. Maybe. And you still want that?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because if a real investigation clears me," she said, "then that belongs to me. But if one phone call from you buys me peace, I'll owe you until the day I die. And every time anyone mentions Hollis Street School, there will be a voice in my head saying, yes, it's true. You couldn't do it on your own. Preston looked at her. You can't understand, she said. You've never had to prove anything to anyone. You're wrong. Then you do understand. He said nothing more. He straightened and walked to the window, where he stood with his back to her for a very long time. Audrey didn't rush him. She heard the clock on the wall and the cars on the street below, and nothing else. Do you know what you're asking me to do? He asked without turning around. Yes. Say it. I'm asking you to stand still. Preston turned back toward her. In my entire life, I've never stood still when something happened to one of my own, he said. I'm not one of your own. No, he said. You're not. He returned to the desk and sat down, remaining there in silence for a while, with both hands resting on the desktop, exactly as he had sat in the room during the reading of the will that day. People are going to say terrible things about you, he said. They already have. It'll get worse. Yes. And I'm not allowed to say a single word. No. Even when I know they're wrong. Especially when you know they're wrong, Audrey said. Preston lowered his eyes to the desk. How long? He asked. I don't know. 3 months. 6 months. Until someone is willing to look at the documents instead of looking at your last name. And if they still reach the wrong conclusion in the end, Audrey tightened her grip on the back of the chair. Then I'll live with it, she said. I'd rather lose a fair fight than win one you rigged for me. He remained silent. But I need you to promise me one thing, she said. Say it. You can't touch anyone involved in this. Not the reporter. Not anyone at the department. Not anyone on the commission. No one at all. Preston raised his head and looked at her for a long time. You came here, he said. Alone, at 9 o'clock at night. Walked straight past 4 of my men, just to tell me not to do anything. Yes. Are you afraid of me? Audrey thought for a moment before answering. Yes, she said. But I'm more afraid of the alternative. He gave one small nod, exactly like the one he had given in the hospital room when his mother held both their hands. Then he reached for the phone. Audrey tensed. Nico, he said into it. Tell everyone to stand down. No one does anything about the newspaper. No one calls anyone. Come up here tomorrow morning. I have something else for you. He ended the call and set the phone down. Go home, he said. It's late. Nico Bianchi arrived at 7 o'clock in the morning. Preston was already seated at his desk, with 3 folders arranged in front of him, and he pushed the first one across. My resignation, he said. Take it to Finch before 9 o'clock. I'm withdrawing from the Ashmont Trust's Board of Trustees, effective today. Nico read it. You're not keeping any position? No position. No vote. No power to submit proposals. I'm not allowed to attend meetings, review records, or know what they spend the money on. He pushed the second folder forward. This is authorization for an audit. Every set of books the trust has kept from the day it was founded until today, all 22 years of them, will be turned over to an independent accounting firm. Not one that has ever worked with our family. You choose 3 names and let Finch draw one. Nico nodded. And the third? Preston didn't push it across. He rested his hand on it. This is a letter to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, he said. I'm opening all the trust's records to them. Everything. 22 years. No lawyers standing in their way, no procedural delays, and no demand for a warrant. Nico stood motionless. Did you hear me clearly? I heard you. He set the other 2 folders down. Preston, I worked for your father for 14 years, and I've worked for you for 7. I'm going to say this once, and then I'll keep quiet. Say it. Opening the books to them means opening a door, Nico said. They'll tell you they're only looking at the trust, but their people will sit inside those records for 6 months, maybe a year. They'll see names. They'll see buildings. They'll see who rents the ground floor of that property in the South End, who pays in cash, and where that cash comes from. He paused. That door won't ever close again. Once you open it, it stays open all the way to the end. Preston looked at him. I know, he said. Nico remained there for several more seconds, then picked up all 3 folders. At the door, he turned back. Because of the teacher? No, Preston said. Because of my mother. By noon, it was all done. That afternoon, Preston's office issued a statement. It was 3 sentences long. There was no press conference. No one standing before cameras to read it. only a written statement sent to every newsroom at the same time. The Ashmont Trust belonged to my mother. I no longer have any authority over it. Examine everything. It was the only time in Preston Marchetti's life that he ever said anything publicly. That night, close to 11 o'clock, Audrey's phone vibrated. She was sitting on the living room floor between the 2 cardboard boxes she still hadn't opened. She looked at the name on the screen for a while before answering. "Have you read it?" he asked. "Yes." "Then you know." "You didn't discuss it with me. It wasn't your decision." Audrey leaned her back against the wall. She could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, but nothing else. No cars, no voices, nothing at all. "The Ethics Commission called me this morning," she said. "They've scheduled an interview for Friday of next week. They said I should have an attorney. Do you? I have $3,800 in my bank account." He said nothing. "Don't," she said. "I haven't said anything. I know what you're going to say." She gave a very short laugh. "You're going to offer to pay for my attorney. I was going to tell you to call Finch. He doesn't take my money." Audrey fell silent. She lifted one hand and rubbed her eyes. "Let me ask you something," she said. "Ask. If they reach the wrong conclusion, if next week they say I violated Chapter 268A, suspend my license, and erase my name from the list of teachers in this state." She drew a breath. "Will you fight for me?" The other end of the line went silent. Then he spoke. "No." Audrey closed her eyes. She sat there on the floor of her apartment, the phone in her hand, and something inside her chest seemed to fall. "I won't fight for you," Preston said. "I'll make sure they fight fairly." She opened her eyes. "Because if I use what I have to make you win," he said, "then the people accusing you were right." Audrey couldn't speak. She remained silent for a long time, and he said nothing more. "You're the most infuriating man I've ever met," she said. "I've been told that before." She laughed, and then she realized she was crying, and she let the tears remain because he couldn't see them. "Get some rest," he said. "Next Friday is still a long way off." "Yes." "Miss Bennett." "Yes?" "That day when you were sitting on the classroom floor," he said. Audrey's head snapped up. "My men were outside the schoolyard that afternoon," Preston said. "I sent them there that morning in case reporters came looking for you. I told them not to let you see them. I didn't interfere with anything," he said. "I just didn't want anyone pointing a camera through the classroom door at that moment." She tightened her grip on the phone. "As of today, I no longer have a vote in that trust," he said. "You and Finch make every decision. If anyone asks you anything about me, tell them the truth. All of it. You don't have to protect me from anything. You know what they'll use it for." "I know." "Then why are you still telling me to speak freely?" "Because you asked me to stand still," Preston said. "I'm standing still." 3 days later, Audrey came home close to 7 o'clock in the evening and found the door to her apartment slightly ajar. She stood in the hallway for a moment before pushing it open. The place wasn't badly disturbed. The kitchen drawers had been pulled out, the closet had been opened, and several books on the shelf had been shoved aside. Her laptop was still on the dining table. Her wallet was still inside the canvas bag hanging behind the door, with more than $200 in cash untouched. The silver pocket watch was still in its box beside the bed, and no one had laid a hand on it. She walked through the apartment and couldn't find anything that had been taken. Then she went into the small room. Eleanor's father's desk stood against the wall, the old oak desk Finch had arranged to have brought over from the Beacon Hill house the month before. Its center drawer had been forced open, the wood splintered around the lock, with broken fragments still scattered across the floor. The 2 side drawers were untouched. Only the center one had been opened. There was nothing inside but a few pens and a roll of tape. Audrey called the police. 2 officers arrived 40 minutes later, took notes, photographed the room, and asked whether anything was missing. When she said no, one of them told her it might have been a burglar who left after failing to find anything valuable. She signed the report. She didn't call Preston. That night, she slept at Marisol's house. The next morning, at 6:15, a message from an unknown number appeared on her phone. "Sign the renunciation of trusteeship. Then you'll be allowed to teach again." She didn't answer. She took a screenshot, sent it to Finch, and the old man called her back within 10 minutes, his voice utterly unlike its usual self. He told her not to go anywhere alone at night, and said that if anyone contacted her, she had to inform him immediately. 3 days later, someone did. The call came at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. A polite male voice clearly gave his name and invited her to have coffee at a cafe on Boylston Street at 4 o'clock. He added that the cafe would be crowded at that hour, that its windows looked out onto the street, and that she was free to choose whichever table made her feel comfortable. Audrey texted Finch the address and the time, then went. Julian Crane was already seated at a table in the middle of the room. He stood when she arrived, pulled out her chair, asked what she wanted, then ordered it for her. He thanked the server twice. "I'm very sorry about what the newspapers have written about you," he said. "It isn't fair. Thank you. I mean it. I have 2 grandchildren in public school. I know how much people like you earn in a year." Audrey didn't answer. Julian placed a slim briefcase on the table, opened it, and took out 2 things. The first was a printed document, fully prepared, with only the signature line left blank. The second was a check. He turned both around so she could read them. The check was for $500,000. "This document formally renounces your position as a trustee," he said. "It's completely valid. My attorney drafted it. You sign it, send it to Mr. Finch, and by tomorrow morning you'll have nothing more to do with the Ashmont Trust." He pushed the check slightly closer to her. "And this is so you can live comfortably while everything settles down." Audrey looked at the 2 pieces of paper. "Miss Bennet," Julian said, his voice still gentle, "Eleanor was a kind woman. I worked with her for 30 years, so I know. But near the end of their lives, people sometimes develop romantic notions. She met you, saw something of her father in you, and became confused." He folded his hands together. "She was kind, and she was mistaken. Help her correct that mistake." Audrey reached out, placed 2 fingers against the edge of the check, and pushed it back toward him. "She told me the day I was born was a beautiful day," she said. "Do you think $500,000 can buy that?" Julian looked down at the check in front of him. He didn't appear irritated. He smiled, a genuine smile, almost one of satisfaction, then returned both papers to the briefcase and snapped it shut. "She chose the right person," he said. "I have to admit that." He stood, put on his coat, and left enough money on the table to pay for both of them. "You should stay a while. The coffee here is excellent." He pushed his chair neatly back into place. Then he paused with one hand resting on the back of it and turned toward her as though he had just remembered some small matter. "Miss Bennet," he said. "Do you know how long she lay in that car?" Audrey looked up. Julian gave her a very courteous nod, then walked to the door, held it open for a woman coming inside, and disappeared down the street. Audrey remained motionless in her chair. Her hand was still resting on the table. That detail hadn't appeared in the article. It hadn't appeared in any newspaper. They had written only that Eleanor Marchetti died at the hospital after suffering a heart attack, at the age of 71. No one had written where she collapsed. No one had written that she had been inside a car. Audrey remembered the 3rd-floor hallway that night, Nico standing there reading the notebook, Preston speaking 4 words, and Nico saying, "I'll have Julian handle it." She remembered the 3 pages. Traffic. Nothing more. Audrey reached the north end close to midnight. She told the story from the beginning, adding nothing and leaving nothing out, including the words he had spoken as he said goodbye. Preston listened to all of it without interrupting her once. When she finished, he didn't ask a single question. He didn't rise. He merely walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, both hands in his pockets, and he remained that way for a very long time. Audrey sat in the chair looking at his back, afraid to say anything. The clock on the wall chimed. Then he reached for the phone on his desk. "Nico, come up here." The old man arrived 15 minutes later, still wearing his pajamas beneath his coat. "3 things," Preston said. "First, get all the location data from my mother's car on the night of March 14th, from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock. Second, get the 911 dispatch recordings from that night, every call connected to the address on Prince Street. Third, don't tell anyone what you're doing." Nico looked at Audrey, then back at Preston. "How long do I have?" "Before morning." He left. He returned at 4:20 in the morning with a laptop and a folder of printed pages. Preston turned off the room lights, leaving only the desk lamp on, and Nico placed the laptop in the middle of the desk and opened the first audio file. 6:52. The driver's voice was urgent but clear. He gave the address on Prince Street, said the woman was 71 years old, unconscious, and breathing weakly. The dispatcher repeated the address, confirmed that an ambulance had been sent, and instructed him to stay on the line. Nico stopped the file and opened the second one. 6:54. Another man's voice, calm and measured, almost pleasant. The man said he was a member of the patient's family, that the family had its own car and private physician and was already taking her in, and asked that the ambulance be canceled so it could be sent to another emergency. The dispatcher asked for his name. The man gave one. The dispatcher asked for the case information. The man gave the correct address and the patient's correct age. The dispatcher confirmed the cancellation. The call lasted 1 minute and 40 seconds. Nico opened the third file. 7:09. It was the driver again, but this time his voice had broken. He asked where the ambulance was. The dispatcher told him the call had been canceled at the family's request. He shouted that no one had called, that he was the only person there. The dispatcher said another ambulance would be sent immediately. Nico turned off the recording. No one in the room spoke. The ambulance arrived at 7:31, he said. Preston was still standing beside the window. The number that called to cancel it, he said. A prepaid phone, Nico replied. Bought with cash at a phone store in Revere on February 26th. The store had security cameras, but the footage has been erased. What I was able to trace was the sales receipt. He turned to a page in the folder and placed it on the desk. That phone came from a batch of 12, paid for with a corporate card belonging to Crane Harbor Logistics. Audrey looked up. The company is registered to Julian Crane, Nico said. Preston didn't turn around. What else? There's this. Nico turned to the next page. On the night of March 14th, from 6:30 to 7:40, that prepaid phone pinged 3 consecutive towers within a 2-block radius of where your mother's car stopped. It was there before the driver called 911. It stayed there the entire time. At 7:45, it was switched off and never turned on again. The room remained silent for a very long time. Why? Preston asked. Nico closed the folder. I spoke to 2 people in her office. On the afternoon of March 14th, her secretary sent Mr. Finch an invitation to a meeting at 9 o'clock the following morning. The subject line said the family would be informed of an amendment to the will. Julian was on the invitation list. He placed the folder on the desk. He thought she hadn't signed it yet. He thought the meeting the next morning was for the signing. If she had to be hospitalized that night, the meeting would be postponed, and he would have more time. Nico lowered his eyes to the desktop. He didn't mean to kill her. He only meant to delay her for one evening. Preston turned around. There was nothing on his face. No flush, no pallor, not a single muscle twitching. He walked to the desk, picked up the folder, turned through every page from beginning to end, then placed it back exactly where it had been. Did he know whether she had already signed it? Audrey asked. Her voice was very quiet. Nico looked up at her. She signed it on February 28th, he said, 4 days before he bought the phone. 14 days before that night. He paused. She had signed it 3 weeks earlier. He delayed her by 39 minutes over something that was already done. Audrey rose. She walked to the door, opened it, stepped into the hallway, and made it 3 steps before stopping. Then her back came against the wall, and she slid down until she was crouched on the hallway floor with both arms wrapped around her knees. 39 minutes. The old woman had sat in that car with a gift box in her lap, on her way to a restaurant in Charlestown where a table had been set for 2 and 2 candles waited unlit. She had left early. She always left early. In the room behind Audrey, no one turned on the lights. Nothing shattered. There was only Preston's voice saying something very softly to Nico. Too softly for Audrey to hear. And then, absolute silence. By 5 o'clock in the morning, the entire organization knew. Men arrived and filled the downstairs hallway. But no one spoke above a murmur. Nico stood in the study with Preston, and he said only one thing. All you have to do is nod. Preston didn't nod. He sat behind the desk with one hand resting on the folder, and for 20 minutes, he said nothing. Audrey came in close to 6 o'clock. She walked past Nico, approached the desk, and placed the silver pocket watch on the wood directly in front of Preston. She told me that you stopped crying when you were 13, she said. She didn't tell me why, but she did tell me what she wanted more than anything else in this world. Preston looked up. She wanted you to be the first man in this family to die of old age, Audrey said. She said nothing more. She turned and left the room, and she didn't wait in the doorway to see what he would choose. At 6 o'clock that morning, Preston made 2 phone calls. The first was to Special Agent Teresa Kane. He arranged to meet her at 9 o'clock at the federal office, and he arrived on time, alone, carrying 2 boxes of records. The first box contained the dispatch recordings, the location data, the receipt for the batch of phones, and the Crane Harbor Logistics Company records. The second contained files documenting 6 years of his family's transportation operations, with his own name appearing on nearly every page. Kane stared at the second box for a long time. "You understand that you're putting your own neck in the noose?" "If I only hand him over," Preston said. "You won't believe a word I say." The second call was to Nico. "Dissolve it," he said. "All of it. As of today." Julian Crane was arrested 3 days later at his home in Winchester. In the morning, in full view of his neighbors, he was charged with manslaughter arising from reckless conduct and interference with emergency services. 4 weeks later, the independent audit results were released. The Ashmont Trust was clean. In 22 years, not $1 had come from an illegal source. The Hollis Street School grant application had been scored anonymously by an independent review panel before Preston Marchetti even knew it existed. Audrey Bennett had formally recused herself from the vote in writing, in full compliance with procedure, before the day the vote was held. The State Ethics Commission closed the case without finding any violation. The State Department of Education reinstated her teaching license. The city school department expunged her entire disciplinary record and invited her back to the classroom. During the announcement, the chair of the review panel turned one more page. The trust had received 41 grant applications that year. Audrey Bennett's proposal had earned the highest score in all 5 categories. 3 weeks later, the Board of Trustees voted to expand the program to 4 schools in the district and invited her to serve as program director. She accepted on one condition: she would keep teaching her 4th grade class. Toby Whitaker returned the following month. Denise stood in the classroom doorway and apologized over and over again. "You were protecting your child," Audrey said. "I don't blame you for a single second." The price came in November. Preston Marchetti accepted a plea agreement carrying 26 months in federal prison, forfeiture of all related assets, and a permanent ban from taking part in business management. The day before he left, he gave Audrey a small box. She looked at it, then looked at him. "Don't do anything foolish." He opened the lid. There was no ring inside. There was a brass key and a piece of paper folded into quarters. She unfolded it. It was the deed to the Hollis Street Elementary School building, purchased through a public city auction at full market value, with no preference and no exception, then transferred into the name of the Ashmont Trust. "The city will never be able to close that school again," he said. "Neither will I." Audrey picked up the key. "Why are you giving me the key if it doesn't belong to me?" "Because someone has to open the doors every morning," Preston said. She didn't promise to wait for him. He didn't ask her to wait. 2 years and 2 months later, on a September morning, Audrey arrived at school at 7:15 and unlocked the gates as she did every day. Toby Whitaker, now 11 years old, ran past and called out a greeting without stumbling over a single word. A man stood waiting at the curb. He wore an old coat, had no car, and no one was with him. In his hands was a small gift box. "Miss Bennett, today isn't my birthday." "I know," he said, "but I've already missed it twice." Audrey accepted the box. She didn't open it right away. She asked whether he wanted to come inside for a cup of coffee from the vending machine, warning him in advance that it was the worst coffee in Boston. Preston said yes. The two of them walked into the schoolyard among the running children, and not one person in that yard knew who the man beside her had once been, and that was exactly what he wanted. Eleanor Marchetti had $240 million, but what she remembered during the final days of her life was a strange young woman who had sat down on the sidewalk and held her hand without asking who she was. We often think respect is something reserved for people with status, money, and a famous name, but respect only has true value when we offer it to someone before we know who they are. And sometimes, the greatest love we can give someone we cherish isn't protecting them, but standing still so they can stand on their own 2 feet. If this story touched you, we hope you'll give us a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel so we can listen together to meaningful stories every day. How do you feel about Preston's final choice? And has a stranger ever stopped to help you when everyone else simply walked past? Please leave a comment and share your story with us, because we sincerely want to hear what lies deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video lasting health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.